right, let's talk about taste. Taste. We have taste buds. They are in the mouth. Most of them are on the tongue. We will look at these little structures called papillae or papilla, which are little mounts which house taste buds, but those aren't the sensory organs. We'll see that in just a bit. We also have a couple of taste buds on our soft palate, which is right behind your hard palate. If you put your finger on the top of your mouth right behind your teeth, you'll feel the hard palate. And then if you shove your finger a little bit further, you'll feel the soft palate. So there are some taste buds there, as well as lining the cheeks, in the pharynx, which is just this wide open space at the back of the throat, like the oropharynx area, and the epiglottis, which is important for routing food and air down the appropriate tubes. All right, so here, epiglottis, we have our tongue. The tongue is a pretty strong muscle. It's also really good at regenerating. And on the tongue, we have the different papillae, or kind of like ridges, that are there. So on the front part of the tongue, the anterior portion, we have the fungiform papillae. Towards the sides, we have the foliate papillae. There's also the valate papillae that we'll see on another slide. But we'll see that most of these taste buds are associated with the fungiform, the foliate, and then also the valate papillae. Then if we look further back, we still have a little bit of taste buds further back in the throat, like on the epiglottis. We have our palatine tonsils here, and then the lingual tonsils. And the tonsils in general are important because they are cell types that come together to make tissues, which have a large concentration of nonspecific immune cells. All right, here's the valate papillae, and this is showing you the valate papillae, and in association with that is an invagination in the surface of the tongue. Inside of that little invagination, so this is where mucus or saliva would go, we can see these little, they look like lily of the valley flowers connected to a nerve. Those are the taste buds. So in order for something to be tasted, it has to dissolve in saliva. It has to go down into these little pits that surround the valate papilla, and then through the mucus, through the saliva, go into these taste buds, which contain the sensory receptors called gustatory hairs. And that's what you see right here. So we've got our connective tissue, and then we have our cranial nerves, which converge together with sensory cells coming from the gustatory hairs. So again, this is the receptor portion, the gustatory hairs. When we're thinking about taste buds, they're not those, bumps you see on your tongue. They're in the spaces between them where these little valleys exist. And in those valleys, we have open routes to these gustatory hairs. And those gustatory hairs have contact because of this little taste pore, which is open. So here we have our squamous cells, our stratified or highly organized and stacked epithelial cells, a little hole in them called the taste pore, and then our gustatory means taste related, gustatory epithelial cells, so skin type cells, and then our basal epithelial cells. Remember, basal, not only does it mean the lowest you can go in something, that is at the level of the basement membrane, and that is where the stem cells are and where cell division occurs. So as these gustatory hairs and then the associated epithelial cells degrade and die, like you will see in all cells that are in epithelial tissue, they're replaced quite often. They're undergoing mitosis quite often. The stem cells in that area are very active, and they start to divide at the level of the basement membrane, so the basal layer, and then they move upward to replace the epithelial cells. So again, the gustatory hair is the sensory fiber, the sensory portion, which sticks out of a pore in the surface of stratified squamous epithelium in the invagination between the papillae. All right, how does a taste become encoded? Well, these are cells, so the gustatory hairs attached to these gustatory cells, they can have action potentials, which start as something called a generator potential. So it starts as a smaller type of potential or smaller excitement of that cell. It depolarizes a little bit, and then there's neurotransmitter release. So we get first this small potential called a generated potential that then sum up together to give us a big old action potential. Depending upon how important that taste is to our survival, that will tell you what our threshold for activation is. So, for example, most poisons are bitter. So when you come into contact with a poisonous berry, with a poisonous whatever, even if you put a pill in your mouth and crunch it, you'll notice that it's bitter, right? It doesn't taste good. That binds to bitter receptors. And bitter receptors, because poisons are bitter, they're really sensitive. So that means that they fire really easily. So they have a low threshold for activation. Whereas things like sweet smell or sweet tastes, they have a much higher threshold because sweet is not necessary for our survival. We enjoy it, but that doesn't mean life or death. Whereas something bitter will tell us if something is going to kill us or not at the most evolutionary level. All taste receptors adapt in about 3 to 5 seconds, which is why the first bite of something tastes the best. Like you want something so bad, like cheesecake, and then you taste it and you're like, this is the best thing ever. This is the best moment of my life. And then when you're, taking your 5th bite, it's like not as good. It's still cheesecake, right, man? But it doesn't taste as good. That's because they've gotten used to it. So really the first taste of something is the strongest stimulation. Taste cells after about 1 to 5 minutes completely adapt. So any kind of tasting of anything after 5 minutes is really for nutrition and not for what we call hedonic feeding, which is feeding for pleasure, like eating things that you enjoy. All right. Also, things that taste is important for, not just detecting poisons, but depending upon how something tastes, it involves the triggers for digestion. There's something called the cephalic phase of digestion. Cephalic means head. And that is anything having to do with your head, with food. So seeing food, smelling food, thinking of food, putting food into your head. When you do that, that activates not only the production of saliva, but also about 10% of the acid your stomach needs to digest something is produced during that point in time. Fun fact, there's an area of your brain that causes salivation in response to how much you like that food. So, meaning if you smell something you really, really enjoy, you'll actually salivate more because of your preference. Whereas if you smell something you just kind of like or don't like, you'll still produce saliva because that's a reflex, but you'll produce less. Fun, right? So if I smell brownies baking in the oven, I'm going to get a lot of saliva. Like, I love warm brownies. They are awesome. However, I don't eat much meat. Even when I did, I hate bacon. I hate it. If I smell bacon cooking, still I'll salivate because that's what my body does. Even though I hate it, it stinks. I hate it in every way. But Yeah, because my preference for it is low, I'll have less saliva produced. So our saliva production is actually dependent on how much we have a preference for something. The other thing that taste does is protective. So this is something that helps you survive as well. So certain things you might gag. So that has to do sometimes with taste. But then also with texture. So when things have gone bad, they usually have a different texture to them. So if you detect that different texture along with a more like putrid type of taste, that may encourage gagging, and that can also encourage reflexive vomiting. So if you even put something past your tongue, because we still have taste buds at the level of the epiglottis and the pharynx, we can still get vomiting if something is off, even if we don't taste it with our tongue. All right, so finally, we have just these nervous areas going from the tongue up to the brain. There is one location that is definitely important at the level of the medulla. It's called the solitary nucleus, the SN. And the solitary nucleus is where all the sensory neurons from the tongue and also from other deeper areas associated with the vagus nerve, they transmit information here at the solitary nucleus, which then is going to collect all of that sensory information to undergo thalamic relay. So it'll get to the level of the thalamus. Taste is not something that goes to the emotional center like smell does. It goes to the thalamus for thalamic relay, for processing. And then in this little curved portion here, you can see it's called the insula or the insular portion of the cortex. Cortex is Latin for bark, like the bark of a tree. So it's the outer covering. So here in this little fold in the insula, that's our gustatory cortex. So that tells you the processing information about what you taste. Like, I'm eating a lemon and it is really fresh. That's your gustatory cortex's job. Innervation, cranial nerve-wise, we have a few. We've got our vagus nerve, which is going to innervate the further back areas like the epiglottis, because the vagus nerve is associated with the viscera, and the more hollow organs of the body. We also, though, have the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is named for what it is. Glosso is tongue, and pharyngeal means associated with the pharynx, so that open area in the back of the throat, the oropharynx. And then we have the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and the facial nerve is the front of the tongue, and that is more for articulation and speech. Other things that are associated with the face, talking, okay? So the cranial nerves 10, 9, and 7 collect sensory information from the gustatory hairs of the gustatory epithelium. Those travel along to the solitary nucleus in the medulla, which collect that information to bring to the thalamus for relay to eventually the gustatory cortex in the insular portion of the brain, in the temporal lobe. And that, my friends, that is taste. All right, stay smart.